The sepia-toned photograph sits in my hands, edges frayed, corners yellowed with time. Three young women stare back at me, their expressions solemn as was customary in photographs of that era. They stand shoulder to shoulder in their high-necked dresses, hair meticulously pinned, not a single strand out of place. Their eyes, though captured in faded brown tones, seem to hold secrets that transcend the paper they're printed on. Three sisters, frozen in time. The year was 1915, when the world was engulfed in the flames of the First Great War. Though here in America, in this small corner of Massachusetts, life continued with an uneasy normalcy, like the calm eye of a distant hurricane. My grandmother once told me that photographs capture more than just images. They capture moments, emotions, and sometimes souls. In the old days, she would say, her voice dropping to a whisper as she leaned close. People believed a camera could steal a piece of your spirit. That's why so many refused to smile. They feared letting too much of themselves escape into the photograph. I would laugh at these superstitions, dismissing them as the fanciful notions of a bygone era. I never truly understood what she meant until I inherited this photograph, along with a collection of old letters, journals, and trinkets, carefully preserved in a cedar chest, after my great-aunt Josephine's passing last winter. The three Blackwood sisters, Josephine, Eleanor, and Margaret, were once the pride of Thornfield, a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests in rural Massachusetts. Their father, Charles Blackwood, was a respected physician who had built a handsome Victorian home on the edge of town, where the sisters grew up sheltered from the hardships of the outside world. The Blackwood house, with its steep gabled roof, wraparound porch, and ornate woodwork, stood as a testament to the family's prosperity and position in the community. Local children would whisper that the house had eyes, the rounded attic windows that seemed to watch over the town like a vigilant guardian. That is, until the Great War began to cast its shadow across the Atlantic, bringing with it a darkness that would soon envelop the Blackwood family in ways no one could have anticipated. This photograph, according to the faded inscription on its back, was taken on June 21, 1915, summer solstice, the longest day of the year, followed by the shortest night. A time when, according to local folklore, the veil between worlds grew thin. The Blackwood sisters had always been inseparable, bound by the invisible threads that only siblings can truly understand. Josephine, the eldest at 23, was known for her practical nature and sharp intellect. With her square jaw and serious eyes that missed nothing, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who knew her own mind. She had recently completed her studies at a women's college in Boston, much to the disapproval of the town's more conservative residents who believed higher education would make young women unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. Josephine had returned to Thornfield not out of defeat, but out of duty. Her father's health had begun to decline, and someone needed to manage the household and his medical practice accounts. Eleanor, 21, was the beauty of the family, with her chestnut hair that caught the light like polished mahogany, and delicate features that had captured the attention of several eligible young men in Thornfield. Where Josephine was practical, Eleanor was romantic, her head filled with novels and dreams of love that would sweep her away from the confines of small-town life. Her laughter could be heard throughout the Blackwood house like music, bringing warmth to even the coldest winter days. And then there was Margaret, the youngest at 19, quiet and thoughtful, with an unusual interest in photography and the occult, interests she carefully concealed from her father's disapproving eyes. Margaret moved through the world as if she were partially in another realm, her dark eyes often distant, observing things others couldn't see. She had converted a small storage room in the attic into a dark room where she developed her photographs, filling countless albums with images of Thornfield and its surroundings. Ordinary scenes that somehow, through her lens, took on an otherworldly quality. The story of this photograph began to unfold as I read through Margaret's journal, its pages filled with elegant handwriting and occasional sketches of strange symbols. The journal entries from the spring of 1915 revealed a household in turmoil. Eleanor had recently become engaged to Thomas Sullivan, the son of a wealthy industrialist from Boston. The engagement had been celebrated with great enthusiasm by the family, except for Margaret, who harbored deep suspicions about Thomas's true character. Eleanor refuses to see it, Margaret wrote in an entry dated April 12, 1915. There is something wrong with Thomas, the way his smile never reaches his eyes, the way animals grow quiet in his presence, Last night I saw him standing at the edge of the woods behind our house, perfectly still, staring at Eleanor's bedroom window for nearly an hour. When I mentioned it at breakfast, he laughed it off, claiming he had been smoking a cigarette and admiring the night sky. Eleanor believed him. Josephine did not. As the weeks passed, Margaret's entries grew increasingly concerned. She described strange occurrences in the house, objects moving on their own, cold spots in rooms, the sound of footsteps when no one was there. The family's elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Perkins, who had served the Blackwoods since the girls were infants, refused to enter certain rooms alone and took to carrying a small Bible in her apron pocket. The gardener reported that flowers near Thomas's favorite bench in the garden would wilt overnight, despite being healthy the day before. Most disturbing were the dreams shared by all three sisters. Dreams of a figure in white standing at the foot of their beds, watching silently before dissolving into the darkness. "I woke again last night," wrote Margaret on May 30th, "to find that presence in my room. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by shadow, but I knew it was watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound would come. When I finally managed to light my lamp, it was gone." At breakfast, both Josephine and Eleanor looked exhausted. Neither would speak of why, but I recognized the haunted look in their eyes. It had visited them too. Josephine believes there is a rational explanation. Margaret wrote, "She always does, but I know better. Something has followed Thomas into our home, something that watches and waits." The tension in the Blackwood household reached its peak in early June when Eleanor discovered Thomas in Charles Blackwood's study, rifling through documents relating to the family's finances. When confronted, Thomas's charming facade cracked, revealing a calculating man desperate for the Blackwood fortune to save his family from financial ruin. The engagement was broken off immediately, and Thomas was ordered never to return to the Blackwood home. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 3 days later, Eleanor disappeared. She had gone for her usual morning walk along the wooded path behind the house, a leather-bound volume of Keats's poetry tucked under her arm, and never returned. The family first noticed her absence at lunchtime. By afternoon, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon, Charles Blackwood had contacted the sheriff. By evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the Blackwood house, the town organized search parties that combed the woods with lanterns and dogs, calling Eleanor's name into the darkness. For 3 days, they searched, in culverts and ravines, in abandoned barns and fishing cabins, along the river that bordered the eastern edge of town. They found nothing but a single hair ribbon, caught on a bramble near the path where Eleanor had last been seen. Thomas Sullivan, now under suspicion, was questioned repeatedly by the local sheriff but maintained his innocence, providing an alibi that placed him in Boston at the time of Eleanor's disappearance. His father, the industrialist, hired a prominent lawyer from the city who threatened legal action if the harassment of his client continued. The sheriff, a man whose authority rarely extended beyond settling disputes at the local tavern, backed down. Josephine, ever practical, worked with the authorities, following every possible lead. She interviewed Eleanor's friends, checked train schedules, and wrote dozens of letters to hospitals and police stations in neighboring towns. Her determination was fueled by a refusal to consider the worst possibilities, focusing instead on action, on solutions, on finding her sister alive and well. Margaret, however, turned to more unconventional methods. Her journal entries from this period describe rituals performed at midnight, consultations with a mysterious woman who lived on the outskirts of town, Madame Laveau, a descendant of New Orleans Vodou practitioners who had settled in Massachusetts after fleeing a yellow fever epidemic decades earlier, and attempts to communicate with Eleanor through something she called the veil. Madame Laveau says Eleanor is neither here nor there, Margaret wrote on June 15th. She exists in the in-between, a place of shadows and whispers. I've given her a lock of Eleanor's hair, 3 drops of my own blood, and Father's silver pocket watch. She promises these items will help create a bridge, a way for Eleanor to find her way back to us. Josephine would be furious if she knew. She believes only in what she can see and touch. But there are forces in this world beyond her understanding, beyond anyone's understanding. Forces I intend to use to bring our sister home. As I read through these journal entries in my apartment, with rain pattering against the windows in an eerily similar fashion to how Margaret described that fateful week, I found myself drawn deeper into the Blackwood mystery. The photograph sat on my desk, the 3 sisters watching me as I uncovered their secrets. Sometimes, late at night, I could swear their expressions changed slightly when I looked away. A subtle shift in the eyes, a slight curve of the lips. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just the play of shadows and light. But back to that summer of 1915. Then, on June 20th, exactly 2 weeks after Eleanor's disappearance, Margaret wrote a single line in her journal. "She's coming back tomorrow. I've made sure of it." The page was stained with what appeared to be candle wax and smelled faintly of herbs, rosemary and something sharper, something that made my nose burn even a century later when I opened the journal to that page. The next day, June 21st, the summer solstice, Charles Blackwood insisted on having a family photograph taken. Perhaps he wanted to maintain some semblance of normalcy amid the tragedy, or perhaps he simply couldn't bear the thought of his family being permanently reduced from 4 to 3. The weight of Eleanor's absence had aged him considerably. His hair had turned almost completely white in the 2 weeks since her disappearance, and deep lines had etched themselves around his mouth and eyes. Whatever his reasons, he arranged for a photographer to come to the house that afternoon. The photographer was Frederick Winters, a middle-aged man with a reputation for capturing striking images. In his written account, which I discovered in a dusty box in the archives of the Thornfield Historical Society, he described the atmosphere at the Blackwood house as oppressive, like the air before a violent storm. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Father is insisting on this photograph," Margaret wrote. "He doesn't understand what day it is. He doesn't know what I've done. But by sunset, we will all be together again, even if just for a moment." The photographer arrived at 4 o'clock, setting up his equipment in the garden behind the Blackwood house. It was a beautiful garden, with roses climbing trellises, beds of lavender and foxglove, and a small pond where water lilies floated like stars on the dark surface. A wrought iron bench sat beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches spreading wide to provide shade from the summer sun. This was where Eleanor had often sat to read her poetry, where Margaret had taken dozens of photographs in different lights and seasons, where Josephine would sometimes escape to when the responsibilities of the household became too overwhelming. Charles Blackwood, looking older than his years, sat stoically on the bench to the side as Josephine and Margaret took their positions for the photograph. Josephine wore a high-necked black dress, her hair pulled back severely from her face. Margaret, in contrast, wore white, a choice that Frederick Winters noted as unusual for the time, as white was typically reserved for debutantes or brides. The absence of Eleanor was a palpable void between them, a negative space that seemed to distort the very air. What happened next was recorded in both Margaret's journal and, surprisingly, in the photographer's own account, which I discovered in the archives of the Thornfield Historical Society. As the photographer prepared to take the picture, a cool breeze swept through the garden, despite the summer heat. The flowers swayed as if pushed by invisible hands, and the surface of the pond rippled in concentric circles. The light changed, as if a cloud had passed over the sun, though the sky was clear blue from horizon to horizon. Birds fell silent. Even the insects ceased their summer droning. A profound hush fell over the garden, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And then, according to both accounts, Eleanor simply appeared. She didn't walk into the frame or approach from the house. One moment, the space between Josephine and Margaret was empty, and the next, Eleanor stood there, wearing the same white dress she had worn on the day she disappeared. Her hair was arranged exactly as it had been that morning, adorned with a small pearl clip that had been a gift from her mother before her death. She smiled, not at the camera, but at some point beyond it, as if seeing something or someone that no one else could perceive. The photographer, momentarily startled, nearly dropped his camera. In his account, he wrote, "I have been capturing images for 23 years. I have photographed weddings and funerals, portraits and landscapes. Never have I witnessed anything like what occurred in the Blackwood garden that day." The young lady, whom I later learned was the missing Eleanor, appeared as solid and real as her sisters, yet there was something different about her, a quality I struggle to describe. It was as if she were illuminated from within, her skin possessing a translucence that my camera could not possibly capture, and her eyes knew things no young woman should know. Frederick Winters quickly regained his composure and captured the image, the very photograph I now held in my hands. 3 sisters, side by side, their expressions unreadable. Josephine, Eleanor, and Margaret Blackwood, reunited. In the photograph, nothing appears unusual. Eleanor looks as solid and present as her sisters, though perhaps her eyes hold a distant quality, as if she's looking at something far beyond the camera's lens. Except, according to Margaret's journal, Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't move after taking her position. And when the photograph was complete and the photographer began to pack his equipment, she turned and walked toward the woods, her figure becoming increasingly transparent until she vanished among the trees. Charles Blackwood, who had dozed off in his chair, saw nothing of this. When shown the developed photograph days later, he flew into a rage, accusing the photographer of cruel trickery. The photographer, bewildered, insisted he had merely captured what was before his lens. The most chilling entry in Margaret's journal came the day after the photograph was taken. It worked, but not as I intended. I opened the door, but I couldn't bring her back completely. Something else came through instead, something wearing Eleanor's face. It's still here. I can feel it in the house. Watching, waiting. What have I done? 3 days after the photograph was taken, search parties found Eleanor's body in a shallow grave deep in the woods. She had been dead for nearly 2 weeks. The medical examiner determined she had died on the very day she disappeared. Thomas Sullivan, despite his alibi, became the primary suspect, but before he could be arrested, he was found dead in his Boston apartment, having apparently taken his own life. The case was considered closed, but the story didn't end there. Margaret's journal entries became increasingly erratic in the weeks that followed. She wrote of hearing Eleanor's voice calling from the woods, of seeing her sister's reflection in mirrors and windows, of waking to find wet footprints leading from her bedroom to the garden door. "She's still here," Margaret wrote in late July. "Not Eleanor, the thing that came through wearing her face. It wants something from me. I can't sleep, I can't eat. Josephine thinks I'm losing my mind with grief. Perhaps I am." By August, Margaret's health had deteriorated significantly. She refused to leave her room, barely ate, and spoke to no one except Josephine. Charles Blackwood, concerned for his youngest daughter's sanity, consulted with colleagues about having her committed to an asylum, a fate many young women faced in that era for behaviors deemed inappropriate or inexplicable. Josephine, however, defended her sister fiercely. According to letters she wrote to a friend in Boston, she had begun to experience strange phenomena herself, the sound of Eleanor's favorite melody being played on the piano in the middle of the night, the scent of her perfume lingering in empty rooms, objects associated with Eleanor moving from their usual places. "I am not one to believe in ghosts or spirits," Josephine wrote, "but I cannot deny what I have witnessed in this house. Something is here with us, something that knows us, and I fear it means to do Margaret harm." On September 1st, 1915, Margaret Blackwood vanished. Like Eleanor before her, she simply disappeared without a trace. Her room was found empty, her bed unslept in, her journal open on her desk to an unfinished entry. "I know what it wants now. It doesn't want to leave. It wants me to..." The search for Margaret was even more extensive than the one for Eleanor, but no trace of her was ever found. No body, no grave, nothing to indicate what had happened to the youngest Blackwood sister. Josephine, now the sole remaining Blackwood daughter, became withdrawn and solitary. She rarely left the house, spending her days organizing and reorganizing her sister's belongings, as if by arranging their physical possessions, she could make sense of their disappearances. Charles Blackwood, broken by the loss of 2 daughters, died of what was officially recorded as heart failure in early 1916, though rumors in town suggested he had taken an overdose of his own medications. And so, Josephine was left alone in the Blackwood house. She never married, never moved away, and according to local accounts, rarely received visitors. The grand Victorian home fell into disrepair around her as the years passed. In 1925, 10 years after the photograph was taken, a young woman arrived in Thornfield, claiming to be a distant cousin of the Blackwood family. Her name was Helen Pierce, and she had come, she said, to check on Josephine's welfare after receiving a troubling letter. Helen was a slender woman with copper-colored hair and green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to urban life, her clothing fashionable but practical, her manner direct but not unkind. The townspeople, who had by then woven the Blackwood tragedies into local legend, were suspicious of this newcomer. They had grown accustomed to curious outsiders making pilgrimages to Thornfield to see the haunted Blackwood house or to hear the story of the vanished sisters. But Helen was different. She asked questions that suggested an intimate knowledge of the family. Details about Eleanor's favorite books, Margaret's photographic techniques, Josephine's studies in Boston. Details that weren't part of the public story. Helen took a room at the local boarding house, a modest establishment run by Mrs. Abigail Carter, a widow known for her excellent cooking and her even more excellent gossip. From this strategic position, Helen made daily visits to the Blackwood home, walking the half-mile each way regardless of weather. At first, Josephine refused to see her, sending the aging housekeeper, Mrs. Perkins, to turn Helen away at the door. But Helen was persistent, leaving small gifts on the porch: fresh flowers, books from Boston, a tin of expensive tea, along with notes written in an elegant hand. Eventually, on her 5th day in Thornfield, Josephine relented. What transpired between Helen Pierce and Josephine Blackwood during those visits remains largely unknown. The few accounts that exist come from the boarding house owner, who reported that Helen would return each evening looking increasingly troubled. She would sit alone at dinner, pushing food around her plate. Her earlier confidence diminished. She began to request that a lamp be left burning in her room throughout the night. On several occasions, Mrs. Carter heard her pacing the floor at odd hours, murmuring to herself in what sounded like heated arguments with an unseen companion. "She's not well," Helen reportedly told the boarding house owner one evening, her voice low, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "She believes they're still in the house with her, Eleanor and Margaret. She hears them walking at night, whispering in rooms where no one has set foot for years. She leaves meals for them in the dining room. And the photograph, she keeps it with her always, talking to it as if her sisters can hear her through it. Sometimes." Here, Helen had paused, glancing nervously at the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. "Sometimes, she insists that I look at it too, that I acknowledge them, that I join them for tea." A shudder had run through her as she added, "And the strangest thing is, when I look at that photograph now, I can almost see a 4th figure forming in the background." After 2 weeks in Thornfield, Helen Pierce made one final visit to the Blackwood house. According to the boarding house owner, she left early in the morning, carrying a small suitcase. She never returned to collect the rest of her belongings. When concerns about both women's whereabouts were raised the following day, the sheriff paid a visit to the Blackwood house. He found it empty. Josephine was gone. Helen was gone. The only thing out of place was the photograph of the 3 sisters, placed prominently on the mantelpiece in the drawing room. The sheriff's report noted something unusual about the photograph. While it still showed 3 young women, their positions had changed. Now Josephine stood in the center, with Eleanor and Margaret on either side of her, their hands on her shoulders. All 3 were smiling, an unusual feature for photographs of that era. The Blackwood house remained empty after that. No relatives came forward to claim the property, and eventually it was acquired by the town. Various attempts were made over the years to renovate and occupy it, but none were successful. Tenants complained of strange noises, unexplained cold spots, and the persistent feeling of being watched. By the 1950s, the house had been abandoned altogether and was finally demolished in 1963 to make way for a new road. The photograph, along with Margaret's journal and Josephine's letters, somehow found their way to the Thornfield Historical Society, where they remained largely forgotten until my great-aunt Josephine, named after her great-grandmother, inherited them as the last known Blackwood descendant. My great-aunt never spoke much about her family history. When I asked her about the Blackwoods as a child, she would change the subject or tell me I was too young for such stories. It was only after her death, when I inherited her belongings, that I began to understand her reticence. Among her possessions I found newspaper clippings, historical records, and personal notes that filled in many of the gaps in the Blackwood story. The most significant discovery, however, was a letter addressed to me, to be opened after her death. It was sealed with dark red wax, impressed with a symbol I didn't recognize, a tree with roots that formed a perfect circle around it. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for formal correspondence in an earlier era. My name was written on the envelope in a shaky hand. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. "My dear grandniece," she wrote, the penmanship deteriorating as the letter progressed, as if each word required greater effort than the last. "I have carried the burden of the Blackwood legacy for too long. Now it passes to you, the last of our line. The photograph you will find among my belongings is not what it appears to be. It has power I have spent my life containing. They are still there, within the frame, waiting. Margaret opened a door that summer day in 1915, and it has never fully closed. The boundary between worlds is thinner in some places than others. The Blackwood garden was one such place, a place where realities overlap, where what is dead and what is living sometimes blur together. Be careful who you show it to. Be careful where you keep it. The sisters are patient. They have waited this long. They can wait longer. And whatever you do, never ever call their names while looking at their images. Names have power. Names are invitations, and they are waiting for an invitation to return. The letter continued on the reverse side, the handwriting becoming almost illegible, descending into a frantic scrawl. I can hear them now, moving about the house. Margaret's footsteps in the attic, Eleanor's humming from the garden. They found me, after all these years. I thought I had escaped them when I changed my name, when I moved to the city. But blood calls to blood, and Blackwood blood runs strongest of all. They're coming for me tonight. I can feel it. The photograph, it's changed again. Now we're all in it, standing in the garden, waiting for you. I dismissed her warnings as the fanciful fears of an elderly woman, perhaps suffering from dementia in her final days. The Blackwood story was fascinating, certainly, a tragic tale of a family destroyed by circumstances both mundane and possibly supernatural, but surely nothing more than that. A story, ancient history. I displayed the photograph on my mantelpiece, alongside other family heirlooms, intrigued by the narrative but skeptical of its supernatural elements. I would look at it sometimes while sipping my morning coffee, studying the faces of these women who shared my blood, wondering about their lives and dreams and fears in that distant summer of 1915. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've begun to notice things. Small things at first. Objects moved from where I left them, cold spots in my apartment despite the summer heat, the sound of whispers just beyond the range of comprehension. My cat, previously the most affectionate of creatures, now refuses to enter my living room where the photograph sits. He arches his back and hisses whenever he passes the threshold, his yellow eyes fixed on the mantelpiece with a mixture of fear and hostility. I've begun to have dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams of a Victorian garden where 3 women in white dresses wait for me, their faces obscured by shadow despite the brilliant sunlight. They call my name in voices that sound like dry leaves rustling. They reach for me with pale hands that seem too long, too thin, the fingers tapering to points that are almost claws. Last week, I woke in the middle of the night to find 3 figures standing at the foot of my bed, their features indistinct in the darkness, their white dresses glowing faintly as if illuminated from within. The air in my bedroom was so cold that I could see my breath-forming clouds in front of my face. One of the figures, the one in the middle, extended a hand toward me, palm up as if an invitation. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, my body frozen in a terror so profound it felt like drowning. They vanished when I finally managed to turn on the light, but the scent of unfamiliar perfume, lavender and something else, something metallic and unpleasant, lingered until morning, along with 3 small wet footprints on the hardwood floor beside my bed. Yesterday, I took the photograph down from the mantelpiece, intending to store it away somewhere safe, perhaps in a safety deposit box at the bank, or buried in the backyard of my apartment building, or dropped into the depths of the harbor. As I held it in my hands, preparing to wrap it in an old t-shirt, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. The positions of the sisters had changed again. Now, they were all looking directly at the camera, their expressions no longer solemn but expectant, as if waiting for something, or someone. Their eyes, once flat and lifeless, as in any old photograph, now seemed to gleam with an inner light, following me as I moved around the room. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was a 4th figure, a shadowy silhouette that resembled a woman in early 20th century dress, her face a blur of darkness except for 2 pinpricks of light where eyes should be. A figure that hadn't been there before, that couldn't be there, that defied all rational explanation. I dropped the photograph as if it had burned me. It landed face down on the floor, and when I steeled myself to pick it up again, the 4th figure was gone. But the sisters' expressions had changed once more. Now they looked almost amused, as if sharing a private joke at my expense. Last night I dreamed of a door standing open in the middle of a forest clearing. It wasn't a door attached to any structure, just a frame with a door, ornately carved with vines and flowers, standing independently among ancient trees, whose branches formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Beyond the door was not more forest, but a garden. The garden behind the Blackwood house as it appeared in 1915, with its roses and lavender, its pond with water lilies, its wrought iron bench beneath the oak tree. The garden was bathed in golden late afternoon light, though the forest around me was dark with deep shadows. I woke with a start, my heart racing, to find the photograph, which I had locked in a drawer before going to bed, sitting on my nightstand. As I stared at it in the dim light of early dawn, I could have sworn I saw the figures move, just slightly, just enough to notice. I'm returning to Thornfield tomorrow, to the site where the Blackwood house once stood. There's a small memorial garden there now, dedicated to the town's history. According to my research, it stands exactly where the Blackwood garden was located, where the photograph was taken on that summer solstice in 1915. I don't know what I expect to find there. Answers, perhaps. Or maybe I'm simply following in the footsteps of my ancestors, drawn by forces I don't fully understand. Either way, I feel compelled to go, to complete some cycle that began over 100 years ago. Before I leave, I wanted to document this story. The story of the Blackwood sisters and the photograph that captured more than just their images. If I don't return, well, perhaps this recording will serve as a warning to others. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The photograph sits beside me as I speak, the three sisters watching with their knowing eyes. In the background, the fourth figure seems clearer now, more defined. And is it my imagination, or has a fifth figure begun to take shape beside it? I've come to understand what my grandmother meant about photographs capturing souls. This one certainly did. The question that haunts me now is, whose soul will it capture next? If you're watching this, perhaps you already know the answer. Perhaps you can see what I cannot. The figure that now stands behind me, wearing a face both familiar and strange, waiting for me to turn around. I can feel a cool breeze on the back of my neck, despite all the windows being closed. There's a faint scent of perfume in the air, the same perfume that lingered in my bedroom that night. And just at the edge of my hearing, a voice whispers a name, my name. I think it's time for me to join my family. After all, we Blackwoods have always been inseparable. The photograph will remain, of course. Photographs always do. They capture moments, emotions, and sometimes, souls. Three sisters took a photograph in 1915. Only two of them were alive at the time. And now, a century later, history repeats itself. Don't worry, though. We'll all be together in the end. Everyone finds their way to the garden eventually. Everyone finds their way home. I hear footsteps behind me now. Light, familiar footsteps that I somehow recognize despite never having heard them before. I won't turn around just yet. Some moments deserve to be savored. But I know who's waiting. I've always known, I think, ever since I first held that photograph in my hands. The Blackwood sisters are calling me home, and so I bid you farewell. If you're ever in Thornfield, visit the memorial garden where the Blackwood house once stood. Stand in the center at sunset and listen carefully. You might hear us calling. After all, there's always room for one more in our photograph, always room for one more Blackwood, always room for one more soul. The camera is still running, but I must go now. They're waiting for me. They've been waiting for so long. Do you hear that? They're calling your name now too.